Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. It's a fabulous bookstore. It began with a death in the family. My Uncle Ed, the most debonair of the clan, a popular guest of the Gentile social clubs despite being Jewish, has succumbed at age 95 with a half glass of Johnny Walker on his bedside table. I came down to Memphis for the funeral. July 12th, midnight. We sit sweating on Aunt Rosalie's screened porch beneath a revolving brass fan, the temperature still nearly 90. For the first time in decades, all the living cousins and nephews and uncles and aunts have been rounded up and thrown together. But only a handful of us remain awake now, dull from the alcohol and the heat, sleepily staring at the curve of lights that wander from the porch through the sweltering gardens to the pool. The sweet smell of honeysuckle floats in the air. Somewhere in a back room of the house, a Diana Krall song softly plays. I wipe my moist face with a cocktail napkin, then let my head droop against my chair as I listen to cousin Lenny hold forth. Now in her mid-80s, Lenny first scandalized the family in the 1940s when, in the midst of her junior year at Sophie Newcomb, she ran off to Paris with a man. Since then, even during her various marriages, she has occasionally disappeared for weeks at a time. She says to me, "Did you know how your grandfather M.A.'s heart attack really happened?" She smiles slyly, sipping on her bourbon. "What do you mean?" I say. "Exertion, bien sûr. The best kind, and not with your grandmother. 40 years ago, I escaped Memphis, embarrassed by the widespread belief that Southerners were ignorant bigots and slow, and I returned only for brief visits. Now I'm back again for an entire month, caught by things deep in me I want to understand." Lenny lights a new cigarette and wriggles her stocking-covered toes, poised to let fly another story. Cousins nudge forward in their reclining chairs. In my mind, I am sitting at the breakfast table with my grandfather, watching with delight as he butters my silver dollar pancakes, then lathers on grape jelly and honey, finally sprinkling sugar on the entire concoction. Sweet as pecan pie, muddy like the Mississippi River. Fragments of visions of Cotton Carnival, Elvis, Malco, barbecue at the Rendezvous. Someone moans from the pool, The Next Generation, and Lenny exhales a cool cloud of blue smoke. Well, that's the opening scene of Screening Room, and the book is about many things. It's about Memphis of 50 years ago and the South when I lived there. It's about the feeling of being in the South, the music, the food, the racism, Elvis, the assassination of Martin Luther King. And it's also about family. It's about my family going back to the 1880s. My grandfather was a towering figure. He started a movie theater empire in the South. He was a world champion bridge player, a great athlete. And it's about the conflicted relationship that I had with my grandfather and my father. So it's about all of those things. It's also about the movie business, because my family was and still is in the movie business and own movie theaters. So it's about all of those things. So I'd like to read you a few little sections from the book. This section is about my mother in the 1940s. The book has a storytelling feel to it. These are stories that were told to me by my relatives. I went back to Memphis a few years ago to try to reconnect with my roots there after having been mostly gone for many years. My mother was a great dancer, and she was a cheerleader for Tulane and New Orleans. So this takes place in New Orleans. A number of the young men enrolled in the Reserve Officers Training Corps at Tulane learned of my mother's exceptional dancing abilities and begged her to offer them dancing lessons, which she was happy to do, provided she received certain compensations. After each dance class, which took place in an unused conference room of the university, Mother would leave her unfinished homework in sociology and history discreetly cloaked within a copy of the Times-Picayune. One of the cadets would deliver the completed assignments to her sorority house the next morning. Although Mother slept in her parents' residence on Octavia Street, she spent all of her waking hours in the grand but disintegrating mansions of Alpha Epsilon Phi and preferred to orchestrate her correspondence and romantic adventures from that address. Mother was perfectly capable of doing her homework herself, but she considered this pact with the cadets a delicious prank, with the added benefit of liberating more time for social engagements. In fact, the arrangement seemed satisfactory to all parties, and then, like many good things, it was taken to excess. To gain favor with her sorority sisters, who were sometimes jealous of her easy success with the opposite sex, Mother began taking their homework as well as hers to the Tulane cadets. The logistics eventually became so complex that one of the students, an accounting major, had to work out a flow diagram of which numerous carbon copies were made. A copy fell into the hands of a dean, after which an unsympathetic article appeared in one of the college bulletins. Yesterday, Dean Howard Barthelme uncovered a scheme in which ROTC students have been completing homework assignments for Newcomb women in exchange for dance classes. I'm quoting from the college bulletin. An investigation of the campus room where the classes were allegedly given, Blessy 131, has turned up several cigarette butts stuffed under a couch, a pink boa, and a cracked recording of Laura Como Lore by Martina Lambasa. Professor David Abernathy of the chemistry department expressed the opinion that the record might be a Cuban rumba, but he was unwilling to join the ad hoc discipline committee. According to several of the cadets, whose names are being withheld, the dance classes were taught by Miss Jean Garrettson, a junior at Sophie Newcomb and a New Orleans native. It's a Sunday afternoon, and I'm alone in the house I grew up in. When the air conditioner went haywire this morning, my father departed for cooler locations. My father was 90 years old at this time. He's since passed away. I remained. I wanted this heat. This heat is the true flesh of the South. It is part of the pace and the manners and the patience I'd forgotten. In physics, heat is motion and speed at the molecular level. But in humanity, and especially Southern humanity, heat is slowness, deliberation, grace, a rounded kind of courtesy. I want to roll in it and taste it. I've stripped my undershorts, and the sweat slowly drips down my bare chest and legs. In this heat, an ice cube melts in 3 minutes. It's unimaginable that people could work in this heat, and indeed, outdoor construction in Memphis comes to a near halt in June, July, and August. Just a few summers ago, 8 people perished from the heat in Memphis. One of the victims was a 67-year-old woman from New Jersey visiting for the 30th anniversary of Elvis Presley's death. She expired at a recreational vehicle park near Graceland. Northerners are unprepared, even though some travel brochures warn that summer heat is brutal in Memphis, as it is in Birmingham and Oxford and New Orleans. It could be argued that the main character of Eudora Welty's No Place for You, My Love, is not the man or the woman who meet in the restaurant, but the crippling heat of the South. Aunt Rosalie, when her memory was good, used to regale the family with stories of attempted romantic adventures in the scorching summers of the 1940s. Before going out to a stroll or to park along Riverside Drive, couples would drive to an ice house on Union and procure a big block of ice. This they would chip through the evening, pressing the melting pieces against their sweaty cheeks and bare arms. It took a 20-pound block to get through an evening. When two amorous couples shared the same car, each pair would require their own cache of ice, one in the front seat and one in the back seat. On Sundays, when the ice house closed, couples would buy Coca-Colas in the filling stations and hold the cold bottles against their foreheads. Some summer evenings, Rosalie says, young people went swimming in their underwear in the little lake at Chickasaw Gardens. The bathers could vaguely see other similarly clad couples sitting on the far edge of the lake, faint patches of white in the dark. Even late at night, the temperature could be in the 90s. Young women swooned in the heat, their dates mistakenly thinking that they'd been overcome by love. This next little section describes a beloved high school teacher that I had named Mr. Crane. So this would have been about 1964, or about 50 years ago. It's hard to believe that I'm that old. I remember my first speech course with Mr. Crane. For the first 3 or 4 months of the course, he did nothing but attempt to teach us how to pronounce words as Northerners do. "You beast will never make it to the stage talking like Southern rednecks," he said. He spent hours trying to exterminate our flat I and replace it with the high-toned and taut I heard in other parts of the United States of America. We had to hold our mouths open like in a doctor's office while he prodded our tongues in the soft tissues of our throats with a popsicle stick to show us which parts of our oral anatomy must be brought into play to correct the defective sounds. The Southern I is a lazy exhalation of air and can be accomplished with a slack jaw, no movement of the tongue, and in fact, no effort at all, almost like an unconscious sigh or a tiny gasp when turning over during night sleep. By contrast, the I uttered by a Northerner is a high-calorie proposition, requiring the lower jaw and tongue to be jerked back while air is somehow forced and reversed along the bottom of the mouth, deflected against the throat, and finally launched forward along the roof of the mouth. That, at any rate, is how it feels to a young person raised on the gentler movements of the South. Even to this day, after Mr. Crane's training, and after inhabiting the upper parts of the country for more than 40 years, I must brace myself to come forth with a Northern I. There were numerous other sounds Mr. Crane taught us to stifle, and others we had to manufacture from scratch. We incorrectly pronounce sure like shua, barley like bali, pen like pin, ruin like ruined. Although Mr. Crane never said it, the strong message we got from him was that we spoke like heathens from some primitive tribe. This message was reinforced when I attended summer school at Northwestern University in Illinois after my junior year in high school. All the other students from places like New York and Boston and Chicago thought that my speech was highly entertaining and had me repeat phrases as if begging the circus clown to slip on the banana peel one more time. Furthermore, these students had polish. They seemed to know everything. When they talked about what universities they were going to attend or going to apply to, they mentioned Princeton, Stanford, University of Chicago, MIT. No one said a peep about Vanderbilt or Rice or Ole Miss or Louisiana State University. I decided I would go north for college, where people spoke proper English. Well, I'm going to read you just a couple of little more short passages. There's a fair amount in the book about the movie business and the movie theater business in particular. I spent time in the projection booth of the early movie theaters. I also worked during the summers at some of my father's and grandfather's movie theaters. And I talk about the magic that happens when we make movies, both, of course, the acting initially, then the magic of capturing it on film, then the magic of showing a movie. The greatest trick of all is what happens inside our minds. Moviegoers crave the illusion of another world. From time to time, we need to imagine that we can inhabit a different reality, a cosmos of beautiful people, dramatic events, times different from our own. Through wars, stock market crashes, and alternative forms of entertainment, people have continued to attend movies in large numbers. When television first appeared in the 1950s, the prophets thought it would replace the movies. It did not. When home video appeared in the 1970s, the prophets thought it would replace the movies. It did not. Likewise for DVDs in the 1990s. Evidently, there's something about an evening out of the house, about watching a story unfold in the dark while surrounded by a crowd of strangers, that cannot be replaced. Could my grandfather, M.A. Lightman, have foreseen so much back in 1915 as he looked out of his hotel window at people lining up in front of a ramshackle store? Did he know that he would become a magician? I remember the years during my adolescence when I sat in the balcony section of the old Malco on Main and Beale Street and watched movies. I saw maybe 2 or 3 movies per week, sometimes 3 movies in a single day. In the cool dark of the balcony, the movies became my alternate reality, tilting and stretching my mind. And when I left the theater, entering the other reality, I began imagining that I could set scenes, that I could bring in a backdrop here or there, that I could position people around me, that I could change the camera angle from sideways to overhead. I began seeing life as a series of scenes. And I'll read one more scene. This is near the end of my month-long visit in Memphis, which was what set in motion the book. My father is tired. I help him into his bed, holding his shoulders and hand. Inexplicably, his hands have remained the hands of a young man, slender and smooth, while the rest of his body has wrinkled and sagged with 90 years of living. After arranging his covers, I kiss him on his forehead. In recent years, he's shown a sweetness that I never noticed before, and he asks about what his sons are doing. He's uttered more words to me today than I can ever remember. Bits of Papa Joe's story Dad has told me before, but I wonder how much I have just now filled in myself and how much he actually said. Has he really been talking? Or instead napping in his chair, as all of us do in this woolen summer heat? I'm so accustomed to layering his silence, attempting to create a thickness from gossamer. For a few moments, I listen to his breathing as he sleeps, then walk out of his room. I'll stop there. Thank you. And happy to answer questions. I'm assuming that most of you have not read the book, so I guess they would just be general questions.
We have a mic we can pass around if anyone has a question.
Well, if you can talk a little bit about your writing process, because your books are so different from, like you write fiction, you write essays. So if you can tell us a little bit about like how was writing about your life and the movies, how it worked?
Well, I don't decide at the beginning whether the next piece or the next book is going to be fiction or nonfiction. I have the idea, and actually, I keep a sort of a notebook of ideas, and I have a policy of survival of the fittest towards my ideas. If the idea doesn't keep me interested for a year or more, I throw it out. I figure that it really is not in me deeply enough to become a book. But if the idea sticks around for a year or longer, then I decide that I've got to write about it. And it'll depend upon the idea whether the book is going to be fiction or nonfiction. So I know that every writer has a different writing process. Are you a writer? Yeah. Usually it's just writers who ask questions like that. So I think that whatever process works for you is the best one. I mean, I know from the interviews of writers in the Paris Review, you can see that they all have different habits. My own personal habit is that I do a lot of revision, and I spend a lot of time with the first paragraph and even more time on the very first sentence. Because I think the first sentence really it begins the creation of the imaginary world, or this could be fiction or nonfiction, but you're inviting your reader into a world that you're creating. And that first sentence is really important. I usually, when I'm working on a book, I usually work about 6 hours a day. And I like it quiet, but I know a lot of writers like it noisy. And so that's a little bit about my process.
We have time for a couple more questions if anyone wants to ask Alan anything. Cool.
Hi, thank you. My question is, since movie theaters were such a part of your family's life and your life, how do you feel now that theaters play a different role in the movie business?
Well, when you say play a different role, you mean that a lot of people watch movies at home? Or what do you mean by
Yeah, there's
that?
so many other channels, and theaters are only one channel as opposed to being the kind of only place you go.
Well, I think that the numbers show that people still go out to the movies, even though they can watch movies with DVDs and streaming and on their laptops. People still go out to the movies in pretty large numbers. And I think, as I said in a little bit I read, I think there's something about the experience of going out that is different from staying at home or watching a movie on your laptop. So there's a whole experience associated with going out to a movie that has a uniqueness. I don't know exactly what the breakdown is for Hollywood, what percentage of their profit comes from people in theaters versus people watching it later with DVDs. My guess is that the most of the profit still comes from theaters. And you still read about movies that make 200 million in the first week out. I think 50 Shades of Grey probably made a lot more than that.
Following your, I guess, more recent, the time you spent in Memphis more recently, how would you describe your relationship with the South? And how is that the same or different than maybe how you felt about it when you initially left?
Yeah. Well, I left Memphis at age 17, and I was somewhat embarrassed because I was aware that people in other parts of the country considered Southerners ignorant. And then about 2 years after I left, Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis, and that made me even more embarrassed. I was ashamed. Of course, I was deeply saddened, like the rest of the world, that a great leader had been lost. But in addition to that, I was ashamed that it happened in my city. And I haven't really gone back for long periods until the period that I describe in the book, which was about 5 years ago or so, which is when the book started. But over the decades, I have come to have a lot more respect for Memphis and the South, and to see it more clearly. I think I respect the manners and the dignity of the South, and there are plenty of very smart, brilliant people that have come from the South. So I think that characterization is not true. So I have a different attitude than I did when I left.
All right. Do we have another question for Alan?
Yeah.
I actually I just recently moved from Georgia. How can I help you? I know. Did you have, even though you moved at an earlier age from the South, did you have any Southern influence writers? My son happens to be a writer, and he's having in Texas right now. And as a military child, he's moved all over.
Yeah. And any writers, Southern writers that influenced me?
Yeah.
Well, I think that...
Flannery O'Connor?
Yeah, Flannery O'Connor, William Faulkner, Eudora Welty. For this particular book, Peter Taylor wrote a book called Summons to Memphis, well, a novel. I think it was about 30 years ago, or maybe more. So those are some Southern writers that... But I think many writers have influenced me, and not just Southern writers. One book that was very influential for this particular book, Screening Room, was a little book by Michael Ondaatje called Running in the Family. Does anybody here know Michael Ondaatje? Yeah. Well, he's most known for The English Patient, but Running in the Family is a little memoir that he wrote about his growing up in Sri Lanka and his family history in the 1920s and 30s and 40s. And he has a line at the end of that book, which in the acknowledgement section, which says that a well-told lie in Sri Lanka is worth 1,000 truths. And he does do some embroidery in writing that book, and I followed suit and did some embroidery in writing this book. I thought of the book from the very beginning as a literary experience for the reader. I know I'm drifting a little bit away from your question now. And so every decision I had to make about which characters to leave in, which to take out, which scenes to recreate and embroider was made on literary grounds. I wanted to give a true portrait of the South, and I wanted to give an accurate portrait of some of the main characters, but I wasn't obsessed with making everything absolutely factually accurate. I was guided by literary concerns. And there are a few other examples of partly fictionalized memoirs as well. So it's not unprecedented. Yeah.
I haven't read it yet. The comparisons to family matters on the other book,
I know Robertson Davies, but I don't think I read that. Yeah. He's Canadian, yeah. Yeah, I know the trilogy. That, yeah, he's a great writer.
I think we had a question back here.
I was wondering, so I would think writing about your past is just kind of an interesting discovery into what has happened to you and how things have changed and maybe how you perceive them now. And I was wondering if, as you were writing, if going back over some of the things that have happened, if a particular moment or scene has really changed, like, your perspective now as you were writing versus when it actually happened for you.
Well, I think that I certainly got a deeper understanding of my relationship to the South and my relationship to my grandfather and my father in the course of writing the book and revisiting the memories. When I was a child, I worshipped my grandfather and thought that my father was a weakling. And my father was trampled by his father, my grandfather, and I thought that he just let everybody walk all over him. And as I got older, decades after I left Memphis, but especially during the course of thinking about the book, I began thinking of my father as a hero, which he was in many ways. He was the first person to desegregate movie theaters in the South in the 1960s. So he played an important but very quiet role in the civil rights movement. And I also began to see flaws in my grandfather. And so my loyalties to my grandfather and father shifted in the course of thinking about the book and revisiting the memories. So that was an important personal transformation. I mean, I think that every memoir is partly a catharsis for the writer.
Do you have another question for Alan? All right, that just about does it then. On behalf of the Strand, thank you all so much for coming out, and thanks to Alan. Let's have a hand for Alan for doing this awesome reading.